There is a moment in every person's life when the floor gives way beneath them, and they realize that everything they thought was solid was never solid at all. For most people, that moment arrives quietly, like a slow leak in a wall you never thought to check. For others, it arrives all at once, like a building coming down around them while they are still inside. What happens next is the part nobody talks about. What happens in the minutes and hours and days after the collapse is where the real story begins. And that is exactly where this story starts. Most people never plan for the worst day of their lives, even when we know hardship exists in the world. We build routines, we build plans, we build identities around jobs, relationships, bank balances, and social circles, never pausing long enough to ask what would remain if any of those things were taken away tomorrow. The answer to that question, when it is finally forced upon a person. There was a man who had worked for 17 years at the same company. He had built his career there from a junior position, worked overtime through his 30s, missed birthdays and anniversaries, and climbed steadily upward. He had a mortgage, 2 cars in the driveway, a reputation in his community, and a quiet certainty that his life was on track. On an ordinary Tuesday morning, with no warning and very little ceremony, he was called into an office and told that his role no longer existed. The entire department was being restructured. He was handed a folder, escorted to the elevator, and by noon he was standing on a pavement he had walked past 1,000 times, holding a cardboard box of personal items, trying to remember how to breathe. He did not tell his family right away. He drove around for 2 hours before going home. He sat in a parking lot of a shopping center and stared at his phone without calling anyone. This is a pattern that researchers in occupational psychology have documented extensively. Studies show that job loss triggers a grief response in the brain nearly identical to bereavement, including shock, denial, and a deep, instinctive desire to protect those closest to us from the news, at least temporarily. What he was feeling in that parking lot was not weakness. It was the beginning of one of the most universal and painful human experiences there is. The weeks that followed were defined by a particular kind of silence. He started waking up at the same time he always had, getting dressed as if he had somewhere to be, and sitting at the kitchen table with coffee long after everyone else had left for school or work. He applied for positions every day. He rewrote his resume so many times that the words on it stopped looking like his own. He attended networking events and smiled until his face hurt. And every night he came home having accomplished nothing visible and felt the particular shame of a person who measures their worth almost entirely through productivity and output. This is where the story could have stayed. Many people never leave this particular room. They find a new job eventually, return to something resembling their old life, and quietly file the experience away as a bad chapter they prefer not to revisit. But something different happened here. About 6 weeks into the uncertainty, he received a phone call from an old friend who had been through something similar 3 years earlier. That friend said something that lodged itself somewhere important. He said, "You are not going through a career crisis. You are going through an identity crisis. Those are 2 completely different problems, and only one of them can be solved by updating your resume." That distinction changed everything. Because suddenly, the sleepless nights made sense. The dread was not about money, though money was genuinely tight. The dread was about the fact that he had no idea who he was without the title, the office, the calendar full of meetings, and the sense of being needed somewhere specific at a specific time. He had handed his identity over to an institution without ever realizing he had done it, and now that the institution had handed it back, he was holding something he had never properly looked at. He started slowly and uncomfortably to look at it. He began journaling, which he described as embarrassing at first, the kind of thing he would have mocked gently in his previous life. He started walking in the mornings instead of pretending to commute. He called people he had lost touch with, not to network, but simply to reconnect. According to research published in behavioral science journals, social reconnection during periods of personal disruption is one of the strongest predictors of recovery and eventual growth. Human beings do not rebuild alone, no matter how strongly the culture of self-sufficiency insists otherwise. What emerged over the following months was not a triumphant return to the career he had left. It was something stranger and more interesting than that. He discovered that the skills he had been selling to an employer for nearly 2 decades were skills he could apply entirely on his own terms. He had always had an instinct for solving complex logistical problems. He had a way of simplifying things that other people found overwhelming. Without the structure of a company around him, those abilities did not disappear. If anything, they became more visible, because there was no longer a system absorbing and neutralizing them. He began consulting independently. The first client came through one of those reconnected friendships. The second came through a referral. By the end of the year, he was earning more than he had in his final months of employment and working roughly half the hours. He was present at dinner. He attended his daughter's school events without checking his phone. He slept through the night. None of this felt like winning in the way he had previously understood winning to feel. It felt quieter than that, more durable, like something he had actually built with his own hands rather than something he had been assigned. The story is worth telling not because it ends with financial success, although it does, but because of what happened in between. Because that parking lot moment, that Tuesday morning with the cardboard box, was not the worst thing that ever happened to him. It was the moment that everything unnecessary fell away, and he finally got a clear look at what was left. And what was left turned out to be more than enough.